I have sat in this chair for decades, and if there is one thing I've learned, it's that the truth doesn't usually scream. It whispers from the corners of a room while lies take center stage and demand an audience. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a home when one person is being systematically erased. A quiet desperation that builds up like steam in a pressure cooker until the only thing left to do is explode or vanish. I saw that look the moment 18-year-old Isabella walked into my dressing room before the show. She wasn't looking for fame or a handout. She was looking for a lifeline. She looked like a young woman who had been shouting into a void for years, only to have her own father tell her she was imagining the echo. Her father, Mark, is a man who prides himself on logic, a man who built a successful career on facts and figures, but when it comes to the emotional architecture of his own home, he's been living in a house of mirrors. He told my producers he wouldn't believe a word his daughter said unless I was the one to vet it. That's a heavy burden to place on a stranger, but it's a dynamic I see all too often. A parent who has outsourced his discernment because he's too afraid of what he might see if he actually looked at his wife with a critical eye. The woman in question is Elena, Isabella's stepmother. On the surface, Elena is the picture of suburban grace, polished, soft-spoken, and seemingly devoted to the stability of the family unit. But as I read through the files and watched the pre-interview footage, I didn't see grace, I saw a gatekeeper. I saw a woman who had mastered the art of the subtle exclusion, the kind of emotional warfare that leaves no bruises but creates a profound sense of exile. Isabella's life had become a series of no's disguised as not now or it's for your own good. She was 18, an age where the world should be opening up, yet she described a life that was shrinking. Her phone was monitored, her friendships were criticized until they withered away, and her access to her father was filtered through Elena's constant presence. Mark didn't see it as isolation, he saw it as structure. He's a man who values peace at any price, failing to realize that the peace he's enjoying is being paid for by his daughter's spirit. When I first sat down with Mark alone, I wanted to see where the blind spots were. He's a tall man, sturdy, with the calloused hands of someone who has worked for everything he has. He told me he loved Isabella more than life itself, but then he immediately pivoted to how difficult she had become. He used the words unstable, rebellious, and ungrabbable. Those are labels. And labels are dangerous because they give us permission to stop looking for the person underneath. I asked him when the rebellion started, and he couldn't give me a straight answer. He just kept repeating that Elena had been a godsend after Isabella's mother left the picture years ago. He was clinging to a narrative that Elena saved them. And to question her would be to admit that his sanctuary was actually a cage. He told me, Phil, if you tell me she's lying, I'll know I can stop worrying. But if you tell me she's right, I don't know what I'll do. That's a man who is terrified of his own reality. He had created a hierarchy in his mind where Elena's comfort was the foundation of the home and Isabella's needs were just structural noise that needed to be dampened. Isabella's backstory isn't one of overt abuse, but of a slow, chilling erosion. After her biological mother exited the scene, it was just her and Mark against the world. They were a team. Then came Elena. At first, it was small things, a change in the Sunday routine, a new set of rules for the kitchen. But as the years progressed, the new rules began to target the very core of Isabella's identity. Elena didn't yell, she suggested. She didn't forbid, she expressed concern. If Isabella wanted to go to a party, Elena would mention a news report about a local accident, planting a seed of fear in Mark's mind until he was the one saying no. If Isabella did well in school, Elena would remind them both of how much support she had provided, effectively stealing the girl's sense of agency. By the time Isabella turned 18, she found herself in a position where she had no car, no job, and no way to contact her father without Elena being in the room or on the thread. It was a master class in psychological sequestration. I watched the footage of their home life, the Nest cams, and the cell phone videos Isabella had secretly recorded. In one clip, Isabella is trying to talk to Mark about her college applications. Before Mark can even respond, Elena steps into the frame, places a hand on his shoulder, and says, "Honey, remember we talked about her staying closer to home? Her anxiety just isn't ready for a big campus." Isabella's face in that moment was a portrait of defeat. She didn't fight back because she knew the fight was rigged. Mark just nodded, leaning into his wife's touch, completely oblivious to the fact that his daughter was being buried alive right in front of him. When I saw that, I knew this wasn't just a family feud. This was a survival situation for Isabella. She was being convinced that she was broken so that Elena could remain the only one capable of fixing her. The escalation happened right before they reached out to the show. Isabella had been accepted to a university 3 hours away. It was her ticket out, her chance to breathe. She had kept the application a secret, using a computer at the public library. When the acceptance letter arrived, Elena found it first. Instead of a celebration, it was treated like a betrayal. Elena told Mark that Isabella had been sneaking around, weaving a web of lies. She framed the secret application not as a young woman's quest for independence, but as a symptom of a deep-seated dishonesty. Mark, true to form, took the bait. He didn't see the bravery. He saw the breach of trust. He told Isabella she wasn't going. He told her she was too unstable to be on her own. That was the breaking point. Isabella told him she would only stay if they talked to me. She knew her father's one weakness: his respect for authority and the experts. She played her last card, hoping that if a man like me, someone Mark respected, could see through the fog, maybe, just maybe, her father would finally see her. Standing backstage, I could feel the tension radiating from the three of them. Elena was primping in the mirror, adjusting a scarf, maintaining that mask of concerned stepmother. Mark was pacing, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. And Isabella was sitting in a chair, her hands trembling in her lap, looking like a prisoner waiting for a verdict. I walked out onto that stage knowing that my job wasn't just to moderate a conversation. My job was to conduct a forensic audit of a family's soul. I had to strip away the concerns and the structures to reveal the raw, ugly truth of what was happening in that house. I had to make Mark realize that by trusting his wife implicitly, he was betraying his daughter completely. And I had to do it in a way that didn't just make them defensive, but made them see the high cost of their current reality. This wasn't about who was right, it was about who was going to survive this family dynamic. As the lights came up and the music faded, I looked at Mark and I knew this man thinks he's here to fix his daughter, but he's actually here to face himself. As we walked out onto the stage, the air felt thick with a tension you could almost touch. I took my seat and watched them settle in. Elena sat in the middle, a strategic move if I've ever seen one, physically separating father and daughter. She adjusted her skirt and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a practiced, pageant-ready expression of "I'm here to help." Mark sat to her right, leaning slightly toward her as if she were his North Star. And then there was Isabella, perched on the edge of her seat on Elena's left, looking small, huddled, and utterly alone despite being in a room full of people. I started the way I always do, by looking at the person who is being marginalized. I looked Isabella in the eye and asked her a simple question: "Why are you here today?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the defiant girl I'd seen in those secret videos. She said, "I'm here because I'm losing my dad, and I don't think he even knows I'm gone." Before the words had even fully left Isabella's mouth, Elena was moving. She didn't yell, She reached over and patted Isabella's hand in a way that looked maternal but felt like a shackle. "Sweetie," Elena said, her voice dripping with a manufactured sweetness, "we've talked about this. No one is losing anyone. We just want you to be safe." "Doctor, Phil, she tends to catastrophize things. It's part of that emotional volatility we're so worried about." I didn't look at Elena. I kept my eyes on Mark. I wanted to see if he noticed the way his daughter flinched at that touch, or how Elena had immediately hijacked Isabella's opening statement to frame her as mentally unstable. Mark didn't flinch. He nodded, looking at me with a "see what I mean" expression. He was so deep in the fog that he couldn't see the hand around his daughter's throat because it was wearing a velvet glove. I turned to Mark and asked him, "Mark, do you believe your daughter is a liar?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "I don't want to use that word, Phil, but she's been deceptive. The college applications, the secret emails. Elena has shown me the evidence. It's like she's living a double life." I leaned forward. "Let's talk about that evidence. You say she's deceptive because she applied to school without telling you. Now, in a healthy home, a kid getting into college is a put it on the fridge moment. It's a celebration. But in this house, it's treated like a federal crime. Why is that?" Mark started to answer, but Elena cut him off. "Because she isn't ready. Dr. Phil, she has panic attacks. She's fragile. If she goes 3 hours away, who's going to catch her when she falls? We're just trying to prevent a tragedy." This is where the psychological autopsy begins. I had to show Mark the difference between protection and poisoning. I told them, "Elena, you're using the language of care to perform an act of control. You're telling this man his daughter is fragile so that he'll agree to keep her locked in a cage you built. And Mark, you're buying it because it's easier to believe your daughter is sick than to believe your wife is manipulative." The audience went quiet. You could see the color drain from Elena's face, but she didn't lose her composure. She's a pro. She looked at me with those wide, hurt eyes and said, "I can't believe you'd say that. I've sacrificed everything for this family. I've been the one holding it together while she tries to tear it apart." I looked at Isabella. "Isabella, tell your father what happens when Elena is alone with you. No filters, no fear, just the facts." Isabella looked at her father, then at the floor. She was terrified. She knew that when they left this stage, they were going back to a house where Elena held the keys. I told her, "You're safe here." This is the one place where her concern doesn't carry any weight. Isabella took a shaky breath. She described the talks Elena would have with her when Mark was at work. The way Elena would tell her that her father was tired of her drama. The way she'd imply that if Isabella left for college, Mark and Elena might finally have the happy life they deserved without her. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy. Elena was making Isabella feel like a burden and making Mark feel like a victim of his daughter's condition. The most chilling part was when Isabella talked about the check-ins. Elena required her to leave her bedroom door open at all times. She had to hand over her phone every night at 8 p.m. She wasn't allowed to have a job because Elena told Mark that the stress would be too much for her. I looked at Mark. "Mark, she's 18 years old. She's a legal adult. Why does she have a bedtime for her phone? Why isn't she allowed to earn her own money?" Mark looked confused, like a man waking up from a long nap. Elena said it was to help her sleep, that the blue light was making her depression worse, and the job. Elena said Isabella was too stressed with her senior year. I jumped on that. Elena said, "Elena told me, Elena showed me." Mark, do you have an original thought left in your head when it comes to your daughter? Or have you outsourced your fatherhood to a woman who is systematically erasing your child's identity? That hit him. I could see the gears turning. For years, he had been told that Elena was the buffer between him and a difficult child. He had been conditioned to see Elena as the solution and Isabella as the problem. I had to flip that script. I had to show him that the difficulty he was seeing in Isabella was a natural reaction to being smothered. If you put a healthy person in a straitjacket, they're going to struggle. That doesn't mean they're unstable. It means they want to be free. I pulled out a series of text messages that my team had recovered from Isabella's phone, deleted messages that Elena didn't know we had. They were messages from Elena to Isabella, sent while Mark was sitting right in the next room. They weren't sweet. They were cold, calculating, and cruel. One read, "Don't bother coming out for dinner. Your father is in a good mood, and I don't want you ruining it with your face." Another said, "I told him you were napping because you were feeling low. Stay in your room." I read them aloud, my voice steady and hard. The silence in the studio was deafening. I looked at Mark. His face was a mask of disbelief. He looked at the screen where the messages were displayed. Then he looked at Elena. For the first time, the perfect wife looked small. She didn't have a rebuttal. She tried the that's out of context defense, but you can't context your way out of telling a child to stay hidden so their father can be happy. "This is isolation, Mark," I said. "This is what people do when they want to break someone. They cut off their support, they ruin their reputation with the people who love them, and they make them feel like they have nowhere to go. Elena isn't protecting Isabella from the world. She's protecting her own control over you by making sure Isabella has no voice." Mark was staring at the floor, his hands shaking. He was beginning to realize that the peace he'd been enjoying was a lie. He had been a silent partner in his daughter's misery. Isabella was crying now, not the quiet, defeated tears from before, but big, racking sobs of relief. She had finally been heard. The truth wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar. But I knew this was only the beginning of the confrontation. A man like Mark doesn't change 30 years of logical thinking in 10 minutes, and a woman like Elena doesn't give up her power without a fight. She was already shifting, her mind working to find a new angle, a new way to frame herself as the misunderstood martyr. I had to keep the pressure on. I had to make sure Mark didn't slip back into the comfortable lie Elena had built for him. I had to show him that being a good man who wants peace is no excuse for being a bad father who allows his daughter to be abused under his own roof. This wasn't just about a college application anymore. This was about the survival of a soul. I watched Elena closely as I read those texts. Her reaction was telling. She didn't look horrified that she'd hurt a child. She looked annoyed that she'd been caught. She did what people with a high need for control always do when their back is against the wall. She tried to rewrite the narrative in real time. She leaned toward Mark, ignoring me completely, and whispered loud enough for the microphones to catch it, "Mark, you know how she gets." She was having one of her episodes that day, and I was just trying to keep the house quiet for you. I was frustrated. I'm human too. It was a classic move. She was trying to pull him back into their us against her alliance. She was reminding him of the burden Isabella supposedly was, hoping his habit of relying on her would override the evidence right in front of his eyes. I didn't let him answer. I stepped in because if I let her get in his ear, we'd lose the momentum. "Elena, stop," I said, my voice dropping an octave, getting that serious tone that lets everyone know the games are over. Don't sit here and tell me you're just human when you're systematically dismantling a young woman's self-esteem. You didn't send those texts out of frustration. You sent them to keep her in a state of psychological exile. You wanted her out of the room so you could have his undivided attention. You wanted her to feel like a guest in her own home and an unwanted one at that. I turned back to Mark. Mark, look at me. You've been living in a fictive reality. Elena has created a version of your daughter that doesn't exist. She's told you Isabella is fragile, unstable, and dishonest. And because she said it with a smile and a hand on your shoulder, you believed her. But the girl I see sitting next to you isn't unstable. She's exhausted. She spent years trying to figure out how to be good enough to earn your protection, while the person you brought into this house was busy making sure she never felt safe. Mark looked like he'd been hit by a freight train. The logical man was finally seeing the cracks in his logic. He looked at Isabella, and for the first time in what looked like years, he actually saw her. Not the problem child Elena described, but his daughter. He reached out, his hand shaking, and touched her arm. Isabella didn't flinch this time. She leaned into him, and the sound she made, a ragged, broken sob, was enough to break your heart. Dad, she choked out, I just wanted to go to school. I just wanted to be a normal kid. I felt like I was disappearing. Mark's eyes filled with tears. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, there was no warmth in his gaze. There was only a cold, dawning realization. Did you really send those? He asked her. Did you really tell her she was ruining my mood just by being alive? Elena tried one last pivot. She went for the martyr angle. She stood up, her eyes flashing. I have done everything for you, Mark. I took on a child that wasn't mine. I managed the house. I handled the schedules. I made sure you could focus on your work without being dragged into her teenage drama. If I was firm, it was because someone had to be. You were too soft, and she was out of control. I leaned back in my chair, watching the mask finally crumble. When people like Elena lose control of the narrative, they turn to anger. They stop pretending to be the concerned parent and start revealing the resentment that was driving them all along. She didn't love Isabella. She viewed her as a competitor for Mark's time, energy, and resources. Isabella wasn't a daughter to her. She was an obstacle to be managed. I looked at Mark and said, Mark, you have to understand the peace at any price fallacy. You wanted a quiet house. You wanted to come home from work and not deal with conflict. So you let Elena handle it. You outsourced the most important job you have, being a father, to someone who had a vested interest in making your daughter look like the villain. You bought your peace with your daughter's spirit. That's a high price to pay. And quite frankly, it's a debt you're going to be paying back for the rest of your life. He nodded, the weight of his own complicity finally settling on his shoulders. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to defend Elena. He just sat there, holding his daughter's hand, looking like a man who had just walked out of a long, dark tunnel. But the confrontation wasn't over. We had to talk about the future. I told them that the current living situation was untenable. Isabella is 18, I reminded them. She is a legal adult. Elena, you have zero authority over her. You don't get to take her phone. You don't get to monitor her emails. You don't get to decide where she goes to school. And Mark, if you don't stand up right now and draw a line in the sand, you are going to lose her forever. She's already got one foot out the door. And can you blame her? She's been living in a house where the air is poisoned. I asked Mark a direct question. Starting today, who makes the decisions regarding Isabella's future? Is it you and her, or is Elena still the gatekeeper? Mark didn't hesitate this time. It's me and Isabella, he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. Elena started to protest, but Mark, he held up a hand, silencing her. No, Elena, I've heard enough. I've seen enough. I've been a fool, and I've let my daughter suffer because I was too lazy or too blind to see what was happening right under my nose. That stops today. The audience broke into applause, but I held up a hand. This wasn't a movie moment. This was the start of a very long, very painful process of rebuilding trust. You don't fix years of isolation with one sentence on a stage. You fix it with 1,000 small actions, day after day, year after year. I turned to Isabella. Isabella, you have a choice to make too. You've been the victim here, but you can't stay in that role forever. You have to decide if you're willing to give your father the chance to earn his way back into your life. It's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of anger and a lot of hurt that still needs to come out. But you have a voice now. Use it. She looked at her father, then at me. There was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of hope, but also a new sense of power. She realized that she wasn't the fragile girl Elena had tried to create. She was a survivor. She had navigated a psychological minefield for years, and she was still standing. I then addressed Elena. Elena, you need to understand that your role in this family has fundamentally changed. If you want to remain in this marriage, you have to step back completely from Isabella's life. No suggestions, no concerns, no gatekeeping. You have lost the right to have an opinion on how Mark raises his daughter because you use that influence to cause harm. If you can't do that, if you can't coexist without controlling, then this marriage is over. Because Mark has finally realized that his first loyalty is to his child, not to his comfort. She looked stunned. She was used to being the one who set the terms. Now, for the first time, she was being told the terms, and she didn't like them one bit. She sat there in a stony silence, the perfect wife facade replaced by a cold, hard resentment. I knew that the real work would happen after the cameras stopped rolling. I had my team set up a plan for them intensive family therapy for Mark and Isabella, and individual therapy for Elena to deal with her need for control. I also made sure Isabella had a clear path to that university she wanted to attend. I told Mark that he was going to pay for it, not as a gift, but as an investment in his daughter's independence. He agreed without a second thought. As we moved toward the end of the session, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of heavy oppression to one of cautious possibility. The truth had been told, the players had been exposed. Now, it was a matter of who was willing to do the work to change. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, that's when the real weight of the day usually hits. People think the breakthrough happens on the stage, and sometimes it does, but the integration happens in the quiet moments afterward. I walked backstage and found Mark sitting in a chair in the hallway, his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had just survived a natural disaster and was surveying the wreckage of his home. Elena was nowhere to be found. My producers told me she had locked herself in her dressing room, refusing to speak to anyone. That's a common reaction for people who have built their entire identity on a lie. When the lie is stripped away, they don't know who they are, so they retreat into the only thing they have left, their perceived victimhood. I pulled up a chair across from Mark. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence do some of the heavy lifting. In my line of work, silence is a tool. It forces a person to sit with their own thoughts, and for Mark, those thoughts were clearly agonizing. After a few minutes, he looked up, his eyes red and rimmed with fatigue. He said, "Phil, how did I let this happen? I'm a smart guy. I run a company. I manage hundreds of people. How did I miss what was happening to my own daughter in my own house?" I told him the truth, even though it wasn't what he wanted to hear. I told him, "Mark, you missed it because you wanted to miss it. You were looking for a soft place to land after your first marriage ended, and Elena provided that. She made your life easy. She handled the friction, she smoothed the edges, and she told you exactly what you needed to hear so you wouldn't have to engage. You traded your daughter's well-being for a comfortable life. You weren't stupid. You were just willing to look the other way as long as the house was quiet. It's a hard pill to swallow, acknowledging that your own desire for peace was actually a form of negligence. But Mark didn't push back. He nodded, the reality of his choice finally sinking in. He realized that every time he had ignored Isabella's tears or dismissed her complaints as teenage drama, he was essentially telling her that his comfort was more important than her safety. I told him that the road back was going to be long. He couldn't just apologize once and expect everything to be fine. He had to prove to Isabella through consistent, repeated actions that he was her father first and Elena's husband second. I told him he needed to go find his daughter right now, not to talk about Elena, but to talk about her, to ask her about her dreams, her fears, and that university she wanted to attend. He needed to start being a father again, which means being a student of his own child. Meanwhile, Isabella was in the green room with one of our staff psychologists. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't checking her watch to see if she was late for a check-in. She looked lighter, like a physical weight had been lifted off her shoulders. I went in to see her, and she gave me a small, tentative smile. I told her, "You did something very brave today. You stood up for yourself in front of the two people who were supposed to be your biggest supporters, and you told them the truth even when it was terrifying." She told me she felt like she could finally breathe, but she was also scared. She was scared of what would happen when they got home. She was scared that once they were away from the show, Elena would find a way to twist things back to the way they were. That's a valid fear. The gravity of a dysfunctional family is incredibly strong. It wants to pull everyone back into their old roles. I assured her that we weren't just going to send her back into the lion's den without a plan. We set up a safety protocol. Isabella was to move out of the house immediately. We arranged for her to stay with her maternal aunt, someone she had been alienated from for years thanks to Elena's concerns. We also made sure she had a new phone, one that Elena didn't have the password to, and a bank account in her name only. I told her, independence isn't just a feeling, it's a set of keys. It's having the resources to walk away if things turn toxic again. She was going to start college in the fall, and until then, she was going to focus on healing and reconnecting with the family members who had been pushed out of her life. The situation with Elena was more complex. In my experience, people with her level of need for control don't fix easily. They don't usually have a light bulb moment where they realize they've been cruel. Instead, they double down. I had a brief final meeting with her before she left for the airport. She was cold, distant, and completely unrepentant. She told me I had poisoned Mark against her and that I didn't understand the sacrifices she had made. I didn't argue with her. You can't use logic with someone whose entire reality is built on a foundation of narcissism. I simply told her, Elena, you have a choice. You can keep playing the martyr, or you can get the professional help you clearly need to understand why you felt the need to destroy a young girl's life to feel secure in your marriage. But know this, Mark is awake now. The fog has cleared. If you try to isolate Isabella again, you will lose your husband. The game is over. As they all headed toward their separate cars, I watched the family dynamic play out one last time. Mark walked Isabella to her car, hugged her long and hard, and stayed there until she drove away. Then he walked to the car where Elena was waiting, but he didn't get in the driver's seat. He sat in the back, a physical representation of the new distance between them. He was no longer her partner in structure. He was a man who was reevaluating everything. I knew that their marriage likely wouldn't survive the year. Once a man like Mark sees the truth about how his child was treated, he can't unsee it. Every time he looks at Elena, he's going to see those cruel text messages. Every time she tries to suggest something, he's going to hear the echo of her manipulation. You can't build a life on top of that kind of betrayal. In the weeks that followed, my team stayed in close contact with Isabella. She started therapy and, for the first time, began to explore who she was outside of the unstable label she'd been forced to wear. She reconnected with her mother's side of the family and found a support system she didn't know she had. Mark, true to his word, began the painful process of self-reflection. He started attending father-daughter therapy sessions with Isabella, where he spent more time listening than talking. He had to hear some very uncomfortable truths about his own absence and his own failures. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments where they took 2 steps back for every step forward, but the important thing was that they were moving. This story isn't a fairy tale. There wasn't a happily ever after where everyone hugged and went back to normal. But normal was the problem. What they found instead was something much more valuable: reality. Isabella found her voice, Mark found his spine, and Elena found herself on the outside of a circle she no longer controlled. It's a harsh outcome, but a necessary one. Some families are built on a foundation of truth, and others are built on a foundation of convenience. When you're living in a house of convenience, the truth is always going to feel like an earthquake. But once the dust settles, you finally have the chance to build something that won't fall down the next time the wind blows. I've seen thousands of families pass through my life, and the ones who survive are the ones who are willing to stand in the ruins of their old life and decide that the truth, no matter how painful, is the only thing worth keeping. The transition from the high-stakes environment of a television studio back to the cold reality of a fractured home is where most people fail. It's easy to be brave when you have a stage, a spotlight, and a man like me backing you up. It's a lot harder when you're standing in a kitchen at 2 a.m. and the person who has been gaslighting you for years is staring you down with a look of pure, unadulterated ice. I knew that for Isabella and Mark, the real battle wasn't fought in front of the cameras. It was fought in the silence of the months that followed. Recovery isn't a straight line. It's a jagged, ugly climb out of a pit you didn't even realize you were in. And as I followed up with them over the next 6 months, I saw exactly what happens when the peace at any price philosophy finally meets the bill. Elena didn't go quietly. People with a pathological need for control never do. When she realized that Mark was no longer her puppet, she shifted into what I call an extinction burst. It's that final, desperate spike in toxic behavior that occurs when a person realizes their old tactics aren't working anymore. She tried everything. She went on a smear campaign telling their mutual friends and neighbors that Mark had been brainwashed by sensationalist TV. She tried to drain their joint bank accounts to protect her future. She even tried to stage a medical emergency to pull Mark back to her side, claiming she was having a nervous breakdown because of the abuse she suffered on my stage. But Mark didn't bite. For the first time in his life, he didn't let logic lead him into a trap of guilt. He stayed focused on one thing: the daughter he had nearly lost. Mark ended up filing for divorce 3 months after the show. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He's a man who values his word, but he realized that you cannot negotiate with a person who views your child as an enemy. He told me in a follow-up call that the moment he moved Elena's things out of the house, the air literally felt different. He said it was like a frequency that had been buzzing in the background of his life for years had finally been turned off. He finally saw that the structure Elena had provided was actually just a slow-acting poison that had been numbing his paternal instinct. He spent that first summer doing the hard, manual labor of fatherhood, helping Isabella pack for college, taking her to get her first car, and just sitting on the porch talking to her without anyone else present to interpret her feelings. Isabella's journey was even more profound. I watched her move into her dorm room through photos she sent my producers. She didn't look like that huddled, shaking girl from the stage. She looked like a woman who had reclaimed her own skin. She told me that the hardest part wasn't leaving her father or the house, it was unlearning the voice in her head, the one Elena had planted there that told her she was too fragile to survive on her own. Every time she finished a difficult exam or navigated a social conflict at school, she was killing off a little piece of the lie Elena had built. She realized she wasn't unstable. She was just a human being who had been denied the right to grow. She started a work-study program and, for the first time, had money in her pocket that didn't come with strings attached. That kind of agency is more therapeutic than any prescription or lecture. As I look back on this case, it serves as a stark reminder of the silent victims in our society. We often look for the big, dramatic signs of abuse, the bruises, the yelling, the obvious neglect. But the most dangerous kind of harm is often the most subtle. It's the slow, methodical isolation of a person's spirit. It's the way a toxic individual can use the language of love and concern to build a prison around someone they claim to care for. Mark was a good man, but a good man who does nothing is just as dangerous as a bad man who does harm. He had to learn that silence is a choice, and that choice has consequences. He had to learn that being a father isn't just about providing a roof and a paycheck. It's about being a fierce, unyielding guardian of your child's reality. The outcome here was a victory, but it was a costly one. A marriage ended, a home was dismantled, and years of trust were burned to the ground. But in their place, something honest was built. Isabella is now a junior in college, thriving in a way no one, especially not Elena, thought possible. Mark is still learning how to be a single father and a man who stands on his own 2 feet, but he's doing it with his eyes wide open. They still have bad days. They still have moments where the old patterns try to creep back in. But now they have the tools to recognize the fog before it settles. They know that the truth doesn't need a gatekeeper, and that the only peace worth having is the kind that doesn't require you to sacrifice your soul. At the end of the day, that's all any of us can hope for: the courage to see the truth and the strength to live in it.